The night Ethan walked out of my life, the world didn't end with a slam. It ended with a whisper. "You were never a real father to me," he said. Not shouted, not screamed, whispered, like a dagger slipped between my ribs. And then he left. No dramatic footsteps, no storming, just gone. I stood frozen in the doorway, my hand still on the frame, as if my grip on that old oak could somehow hold him back. But fathers don't get that luxury. Fathers don't quit, even when their children do. My name is Daniel Wright. To most, I was just another man in town. A mechanic with oil-stained hands, a worn jacket, and a son who looked at me with eyes full of disappointment. But that night, when Ethan left, I learned something crucial. The hardest part of being a father isn't what you give up. It's what you hold on to when everything else slips away. Ethan wasn't born angry. He was born smiling, a loud, stubborn little boy with his mother's dimpled cheeks. His mother, Claire, was the kind of woman who could turn chaos into music. She'd sing while cooking, hum while folding laundry, laugh while bills piled high on the counter. She had a way of making struggle look like background noise to a beautiful life. But fate is cruel, and Claire didn't live long enough to see Ethan grow into the man she dreamed he'd be. Cancer stole her when Ethan was just 7. He stood at her funeral in a suit too big for his small frame, clutching my hand like it was the last branch in a storm. From that moment on, it was just him and me. I worked long shifts at the garage, came home smelling like gasoline, and tried to cook dinners that didn't come out of a microwave. I was father, mother, and sometimes the punching bag for a little boy who didn't know where to throw his grief. It wasn't glamorous, but it was ours. I still remember the night I first burned spaghetti. Ethan laughed so hard milk came out of his nose. Or the time I sold my old motorcycle to buy him a telescope because he wanted to see the stars like Mom used to. I didn't have much, but I gave him everything I could. Somewhere along the way, though, a shadow crept in. That shadow had a name. Victoria, Claire's sister. Wealthy, elegant, married into money. When Claire died, Victoria swooped in with crocodile tears and promises of helping with Ethan. She'd invite him to their estate. Marble floors, chandeliers, a swimming pool the size of my entire street. And she whispered things, subtle but sharp. "You deserve more than this small life. Your father can't give you the future you need." At first, I thought I was imagining it. But then Ethan started coming home with stories that didn't sound like my world at all. He'd compare our garage to Richard's company office, our takeout pizza to their chef's meals, my rusty pickup to Richard's imported cars. "Dad, why can't we have a house like theirs?" he asked once, his voice laced with both innocence and longing. "Because, son," I said, forcing a smile, "houses don't make homes. People do." But to a teenager, wisdom sounds a lot like excuses. The night he left wasn't sudden. It had been building for years, small cracks in our bond, widened by Victoria's poison. I remember the argument that pushed him over the edge. "Dad, I got accepted to Columbia," Ethan said, tossing the letter onto the kitchen table. His voice had that forced calm, the kind that's actually smugness in disguise. I picked it up, my chest swelling with pride. "Columbia? That's incredible." "Yeah," he said, crossing his arms, "but tuition is insane. Victoria already said she and Uncle Richard would cover it." There it was, her fingerprints on my son's future. "Ethan, I can help," I said carefully. "I've been saving." He laughed. Laughed. "With what, Dad? Oil changes and brake pads? Be serious." The words stung worse than grease burns. I'd taken every overtime shift offered, skipped meals so he'd have new shoes, sold off the last of my hobbies to keep his world intact. And to him, it was still a joke. "I may not have chandeliers, son," I said quietly, "but I've never let you go without." His eyes narrowed, jaw tightening. "That's not enough anymore." And then came the whisper. "You were never a real father to me." He grabbed his bag and walked out. The house was quiet after he left, but my head was a storm. I poured a glass of whiskey, though it tasted more like regret than fire. I thought back to the science fair when he was 10, how he'd built a crooked volcano, and I stayed up all night repainting it so he wouldn't be embarrassed. Or the winter he wanted ice skates, and I fixed up a pair from a pawn shop just so he could glide on the frozen pond with the other kids. None of it mattered now, at least not to him. But here's what Ethan didn't know. For 20 years, I let the world think I was just a mechanic. But under the hood of my life was another engine, quiet, powerful, one I'd kept hidden because I didn't want Ethan to grow up with money in place of values. You see, the garage wasn't just a garage. It was the cover for a restoration business that supplied vintage cars to collectors. the kind of collectors who signed checks with more zeros than most people saw in a lifetime. The right name wasn't small. I just kept it small for Ethan's sake. And Victoria? She knew. She always knew. That's why she wanted Ethan closer. She thought she could rewrite history, paint herself as his savior while erasing me. But what she didn't expect was patience. 2 weeks later, I got an invitation I wasn't supposed to get. Ethan was throwing a dinner at Victoria's estate, a celebration before he left for Colombia. Everyone important would be there, everyone but me. I went anyway. The marble floors gleamed like they'd been polished with diamonds. The chandelier glittered, casting golden light on faces I knew didn't think I belonged. I stood in the doorway, ignored, until Ethan saw me. For a heartbeat, I thought I caught a flicker of the boy I raised, but it vanished as fast as it came. "Ladies and gentlemen," Ethan announced, raising a glass, "to the people who made me who I am today, my Aunt Victoria and Uncle Richard, my real parents." The room erupted in applause. Glasses clinked, laughter bounced off the walls. And me? I stood there, my heart breaking in front of an audience. But I didn't leave, not yet, because fathers don't quit. And one day, Ethan would learn who I truly was. As the applause died down, Victoria caught my eye across the room. She smirked, the kind of smirk that said, "You've already lost him." But what she didn't know, I wasn't done fighting, and the next move was mine. That night at Victoria's estate, when the applause died down and I stood there like a ghost at my own son's funeral, I saw it. Her smirk. It wasn't wide. It wasn't cartoonish. It was sharp, like a blade she'd been polishing for years, the kind of smile that said, "Checkmate, Daniel. You've already lost." But she was wrong. I didn't walk out. I didn't raise my glass and surrender. I stood in that gilded room, surrounded by laughter that wasn't mine, and I let her believe she'd won. Because patience is the one currency Victoria never learned how to spend. After the dinner, Ethan stopped coming home altogether. His room sat empty, and the telescope in the corner gathering dust. Some nights, I'd pass by and stare at it, the same telescope I'd once worked 3 jobs to buy. He had pointed it at the stars. Now, he pointed himself at a world where I didn't exist. And when he did show up, it was usually to grab clothes or collect things he thought had value. He barely spoke to me, except for the occasional jab. "Victoria says I should get a proper suit," he remarked once, holding up my old sports coat like it was a dead rat. I just nodded. "Suits don't make men, son. Choices do." He rolled his eyes. "Maybe that's why you're stuck here." The words didn't cut like the first time. By then, I'd grown used to the dull ache. But what Ethan didn't see was the life behind my silence. Every morning, I still opened the garage, greeted by the smell of oil and the growl of engines. To the neighbors, I was just Daniel, the local mechanic. But in the back, hidden behind a locked door, sat rows of restored classics. Bentleys, Mustangs, even a Ferrari once owned by a Hollywood legend. They weren't mine, not exactly. They were projects for men who paid more for one car than most did for their houses. And those men? They knew my name. Collectors called me from Paris, Dubai, Tokyo. They trusted me to bring their machines back to life, and they paid accordingly. But I never flaunted it. My wealth lived quietly, tucked into investments, real estate, accounts my son never bothered to ask about, because I wanted him to see value in sweat, not numbers. Victoria? She knew. She'd always known. She hated me not because I was poor, but because I refused to play the game. I refused to bow. A month later, I got word Ethan was being honored at a banquet, some scholarship dinner, funded by Victoria's husband. Everyone in town was invited, everyone but me. So I went. I wore my old leather jacket, the one that smelled faintly of motor oil no matter how many times it hit the washer. When I walked into that ballroom, heads turned, not in admiration, in confusion. "What's he doing here?" whispered one woman behind a jeweled hand. "He's not family," another man muttered. Ethan spotted me from the stage, his jaw tightening. He didn't wave, didn't smile, he just looked embarrassed. And then, as if rehearsed, Victoria's voice carried across the microphone. "Tonight, we celebrate not only Ethan's achievement, but also the love and support of the family that raised him." The spotlight shifted. It landed on her and Richard. Applause thundered. Glasses rose. Cameras flashed. And me? I sat in the shadows, watching as my son lifted his glass to the people who had stolen him. But here's the thing about shadows. They hide more than pain. They also hide plans. That night, while Ethan toasted to Victoria's empire, I quietly set my own table. Not with champagne and speeches, but with patience and precision. I knew her game. She was weaving a net around Ethan, convincing him her money was his future, her approval his ticket to greatness. And Ethan, desperate for validation, was letting her tie the knots tighter. But nets, when pulled too tight, always snap. The first tear in the fabric came sooner than I expected. It was a Tuesday afternoon when Ethan showed up at the garage. Not the front, the back. His eyes darted around like a thief. "Dad, I need money," he said, voice low. I wiped my hands on a rag, raised an eyebrow. I thought Victoria handled that now. She said it wasn't her responsibility to bail me out of mistakes," he muttered. I leaned against the workbench. "What kind of mistakes?" He hesitated. His pride battled his desperation. Finally, he spat it out. "I bought a car, on credit. Richard was supposed to help me cover it, but now he says I should learn a lesson. I'm behind on payments. They're threatening repossession." I almost laughed. Not because it was funny, but because it was predictable. Like, son, you don't buy cars to look rich. You buy them when you can afford to be poor without one. He glared at me. "You don't get it. You've never had to prove yourself." The irony nearly knocked me over. Never had to prove myself? Every scar on my hands was proof. Every sleepless night, every sacrifice he couldn't see. Still, I sighed and reached for my wallet, but not to hand him cash. Instead, I pulled out an old photo. Him on his 5th birthday, cake smeared across his cheeks, my arm wrapped around him. "I don't have money for bad decisions, Ethan, but I always have time to remind you who's been here since day one." He scoffed, shoved the photo back, and stormed out. That should have been the end. But trouble doesn't knock once. It kicks the door down. 2 weeks later, whispers started. Ethan had been seen at poker tables, gambling with men who smiled too wide and shook hands too quickly. Then came rumors of debt. And then, the call. Not from Ethan, from Victoria. "Daniel," she said, her voice honeyed with mock concern. "Your son is digging himself into holes he can't climb out of. I warned you he'd never survive without proper guidance." I clenched my jaw. "Guidance from you? You mean manipulation?" She chuckled. "Call it what you like, but he's about to learn who really cares about him, and it isn't you." Click. The line went dead. That night, I sat alone in the garage, the hum of the fluorescent lights above me sounding like judgment. Ethan was in over his head, drowning in choices he thought made him a man, and Victoria was circling, ready to watch him sink so she could swoop in as his savior. But fathers don't quit. I closed the garage, locked the doors, and looked out at the quiet street. If Victoria wanted a game, she had one. Only this time, she wasn't playing against the broke mechanic she thought she knew. She was playing against the man who'd built an empire while keeping his hands dirty and his secrets clean. Because the next time Ethan called for help, it wouldn't just test our bond. It would expose every lie Victoria had ever told him and show my son exactly who I truly was. When the trouble started, I didn't roar. I planned. Roaring is for headlines and reality shows. Strategy is for fathers who've learned bruises teach better than speeches. Ethan called me the night the repo man showed up. He had that thin, frantic voice of a man who'd been betting on credit and fast approval instead of patience. "They're taking it, Dad," he said. "I'm screwed." I could hear the hum of the street behind him, the sloppy promise of a life that looked finished because it was bought. For a second, I let him panic. It's important sometimes to let a man feel the bottom. People learn better with the ground under their feet than with someone else catching them before they fall. Then I said, "Bring the keys." He arrived an hour later, breathless and ashamed. The car he'd bought was a paint job and a loan, a pretty box on a rotten foundation. He parked it at the end of my lot, hunched in the driver's seat like a boy who'd been caught stealing cookies. I walked around to the passenger door, set my hand on the roof, and said, "You want me to help pick up the pieces, Ethan? But first, you have to let me show you what I've been building while you were busy learning how to look rich." He squinted at me, suspicious. "What are you talking about?" I led him to the back of the garage and opened the lock I'd kept for years. The smell of wax and leather and old engines spilled out like a secret that refused to stay small. One by one, classic cars rolled into the light. A Mustang with a restored heart, a Bentley with its original leather, a Thunderbird that could make a grown man blink twice. His jaw dropped. For the first time since he'd been small enough to climb into my lap, his face looked the way it used to on holidays. Surprised, hopeful, honest. "These," I said, "are not pretty toys. These are investments. They pay for themselves and for men who don't ask for favors. They fund loans, pay settlements, and, if I want, buy the silence of people who think money makes them kings." Ethan's eyes darted to a ledger I kept in the back, not because I wanted him to see it, but because paper tells truth when mouths lie. He read numbers, then names, then one line that made his face go pale. Transfers to Victoria Wright, not small gifts, but strategic deposits and consulting fees that matched the timing of every scholarship announcement, every generous gift she'd given. "You set me up?" he spat. "No." I stepped closer. "She set you up. She wanted you convinced she made you. She wanted you indebted to her. So she wired money through shells and called it charity. She created an army of favors with strings attached." He swallowed. "Why would she?" "Because she liked being the rescuer more than being a relative. She liked the applause." We didn't leave that night. I sorted papers while he slumped on a crate and watched me move like a man assembling a clock. When I finished, I handed him a packet. Bank statements, transfer records, and copies of contracts showing Victoria's scholarships were, in fact, loans cloaked as generosity and tied to nasty clauses that would have cost him everything if he'd signed the final draft. "It's ugly," I said, "but it's proof." He ran a thumb over his name on a page and then slammed the packet closed like it burned. "Why didn't you tell me?" "Because I wanted you to earn it," I said, "and because I didn't want you to mistake my money for my love. But right now, you need both." We moved fast. Quietly, I negotiated with the lender, not with threats, but with checks from accounts Ethan didn't know existed, and with a leverage I'd saved for emergencies. I slipped in a call to a friend who owed favors in the right places. By dawn, the repo man left without a car, muttering. The loan was restructured. Ethan's name wasn't on the scrap heap. The gratitude in him was raw and clumsy, like a man learning to swallow pride. I don't know how to thank you," he admitted. "You start by not spending like a man who's still auditioning for someone else's life," I told him. "You thank me by staying." He laughed, the sort of brief, disbelieving sound kids make when magic actually turns out to be math. We worked on the car together that weekend, measured torque, changed a filter, laughed at stupid mistakes. Small repairs build habits, and habits build the kind of man who can keep a life. But fixing the car wasn't what toppled Victoria. She did that herself. A week after the bailout, I took the packet of documents to Ethan's banquet, the very stage where she'd toasted herself as savior. I arrived without an invite and sat where the lights were dim enough to leave room for shadows. When she raised her glass again and thanked all the people who made Ethan the man he was, I stood. The microphone clicked under her hand like a trap. She smiled, the preening kind that assumes applause will always follow. "Ladies and gentlemen," I said, my voice calm enough to break glass. I didn't mean to interrupt, but there are a few facts that deserve a round of applause as well. She blinked, then forced a polite smile. "Daniel, not here to be polite," I said. "Here to be honest." I set the packet on the podium and spread the pages. Cameras leaned in. Conversations died. Victoria's smile thinned. "You've spent the past year telling my son you saved him," I told the room. "You structured loans as gifts, so he'd be grateful to you instead of to hard work. You took advantage of a grieving family to place yourself in the center of a life you didn't earn." Someone gasped. Victoria's husband, Richard, paled like a curtain drawn too fast. She opened her mouth, tried to stammer something about generosity and family, but the papers were already speaking. Ethan turned to me, furious at first, then confused, then hollow. "You lied to me," he muttered. "No," I said. "I kept faith. I didn't tell you because I wanted your heart to grow in the right soil. But I can't teach pride by letting someone else buy it for you." The room felt like a lung taking a huge breath. People who'd clapped for Victoria now read the documents, exchanged looks, and asked questions. Victoria lost her audience faster than she'd assembled it. By the time the banquet ended, she'd been cornered into explaining transactions that looked less like charity and more like a takeover. She left in a storm of excuses. Her smile had been a mask. When it slipped, her true face was brittle. Afterwards, we didn't have a movie reconciliation. We had something truer. A conversation with the windows open, late into the night, where apologies were muttered and the long work of rebuilding began. Ethan sat across from me, hands clasped, looking older and younger at once. "I'm sorry," he said, and it sounded like a key in a lock. "I thought you were nothing. I thought you wanted me to fail so you could look better." "No," I said. "I wanted you to want better for yourself, not be bought into it." He hesitated, then reached across and picked up the telescope I'd kept in the garage corner, the same one I'd fixed for his birthday. He set it on the table between us like an offering. "You ever see the moon and think it's too far?" he asked, voice small. "Every night," I said. He met my eyes. I thought I could buy a life that would make up for what I lost. I was wrong, he swallowed. Do you want me to call you Dad? I didn't explain or sermonize. I didn't demand big, dramatic words in return for small ones already given years ago. I simply reached across, squeezed his shoulder, and said, I've been your father your whole life. Call me whatever helps you sleep tonight. He grinned. Not the boy's grin from the past, but a man's tentative smile. A bridge being built, plank by plank. Victoria's laughter still echoed in the corners of the town for a while, but truth has a way of finally finding the ears that matter. It doesn't always erase the scars, but it makes them maps, routes you follow to avoid old mistakes. That night, after Ethan left to start making better decisions, I sat on the garage steps and watched the road. Fathers don't quit. We endure, and sometimes we quietly set the pieces so the ones we love can find their way back. The road ahead would be long, but for the first time in a while, it felt like we were both walking toward the same horizon.